Our next guest on the program, Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching, joining us from our Melbourne studio. We'll get to some campaign stuff first of all, but obviously Bob Hawke. What personal memories or stories can you share with us?
I met him about 22 years ago. He and my father-in-law were great friends and had campaigned together on many issues, probably most notably on superannuation. And I think he certainly was both parts of what was a seemingly perhaps contradictory nature, which Blanche Dalpouget explores in her biography of him, but that intellectualism and that, that man of the people type of approach that he had. And he was very charming and, we had a long discussion about Israel, in fact, and he, was very much an advocate for the state of Israel. But at the end of this, what I can only really describe as sort of a European salon type of environment where we were, he said to me, as I was leaving, he said, well, you're going to have a very interesting, I can tell you're going to have an interesting life. And I said, oh, why do you say that? And he said, well, any woman who wears shoes like that is going to have an interesting life. So he was both, given that he'd, given a great, explication about why the state of Israel should be supported, to then move to that, very charming, he was a very charming man. And, there are many stories about him. Cameron Milner was reminding me last night, who was Bill's chief of staff in the last election campaign, was reminding me that he was able to do, the ad agency in the last election was very surprised that, they went to film an ad with him on Medicare and he was able to do it in one take. And the ad agency, said, well, we do, filming with lots of people, very few people do it in one take. And he said, they don't call me one take Bob for nothing. And so he's, the ad agency people were, they loved him. They wanted to do more ads with him. So, but it's, Tom, it's not just people, in politics who might have had, personal contact with Bob Hawke. I'm very conscious that, today if there's someone hurrying to go home from work today to take a child to the doctor, they bulk bill that visit, that's because of Bob Hawke. There's lots of Chinese Australians who are here in Australia today because he opened his heart and he opened our doors to, to people who might not want to return, after Tiananmen Square, people who might be thinking about retiring, who are looking at their superannuation. That is because of Bob Hawke. So there's lots of, he touched every life, the way we live now. He touched every
I think the interesting thing is, and I don't want to wade into Medicare all over again, but the Medicare debate is essentially one now just about, funding of public hospitals and so on. Back then there was a real debate and a pledge from the Liberal Party then they weren't fans of it. So it is worth noting that. I wanted to ask as well, there's a lot of talk about, well, you couldn't be Bob Hawke these days, you wouldn't get away with it. I think probably in terms of his pre-prime ministerial days, and you're harking back a little bit before my times, it's fair to say, but I'll take Graham Richardson on his word that it might have been an issue what might have got out about Bob Hawke back then. But what about when he was PM? Because maybe, he could still be that person now. There's no one like him now, but there was no one like him back then either, was he? Can there still be another Hawkey-type figure today, or has social media really killed that off?
Well, I think that, people have become a lot more careful because there is, high levels of scrutiny. And I think we can see this really that's originated from the US election campaigns. And I think that it would be more difficult today just because people aren't willing to really, both. I think, there's a greater scrutiny and perhaps a greater criticism. But in fact, I think that, I look around the Parliament and the Senate and there's certainly lots of personality there. It's just that it kind of does stay a little under wraps. And I think that's a shame. I think one of the things that Bob Hawke did was to have, to say that, in fact, we are all human beings. And as human beings, we are not perfect. And, there are frailties and really that you can see it in moments of high emotion in the Parliament, I think, where people do become human. And it's actually, I think most Australians are you know, they can empathise and they can put themselves in that situation and think, well, maybe I might react like that as well. So I think that...
And that sometimes, I guess, the instinctive reactions are the good ones. I mean, you think of Bill Shorten the other day when he was being, you know, criticised over not telling the full story, but also George Brandis when he just stood up after the burqa was worn into Parliament by Pauline Hanson and acted instinctively. And maybe that's missing a bit from politics now.
And I think that's right. And I think it was interesting in that moment about when George Brandis spoke. It was actually the opposition benches that, you know, acclaimed him rather than his own side. And I think that's about a control, you know, oh, well, what should we do in this moment? Kind of, you know, deer in the headlights. But there are there are moments in Parliament, well, there are moments in, you know, media conferences where people do react in a very raw way. And I think that gives a great insight into, you know, into politicians. Also, I think into journalists as well. So it's always interesting, Tom.
Indeed. Look, it's just been really interesting hearing some of the anecdotes about Bob Hawke, even the one about Don Bradman trying to twist his arm on getting the South African team to tour Australia.
Yes.
Well, Bob Hawke basically winning the argument in just a few words, just saying, well, we're not putting politics into sport. The South African government is by only letting white people play the sport. So.
And, you know, being able to convince Margaret Thatcher that, you know, you don't want to be on the wrong side of history about apartheid. I mean, apartheid was a terrible, terrible system. And, you know, Bob Hawke was a leader in saying that, no, this is not acceptable. We are not going to accept, you know, the categorisation of people as lesser. And I think that's, you know, something Australia should be incredibly proud of. But, you know, just about your point, I think, about, you know, whether there could be another Bob Hawke, you know, this comparison has already been made today, but, you know, I see in meetings, you know, I've been, you know, attending meetings with Bill Shorten for a long time and, you know, in both internal and in sort of policy discussions, and he is actually very consensus-driven. So, you know, that chairman of the board style. And I think that those sorts of lessons. But he's not
I guess he's not the figure, though. You know, the character, and certainly hasn't proven to be the popularity with voters, at least not yet. You think he can be?
Yes, I do, and I think, you know, I think you can see at the end of town hall meetings where people, you know, who've been there for the, you know, the couple of hours of a town hall meeting. Remember, he's done nearly 100 of them. They line up to have photographs taken. They line up to say, well, this is why I was asking you this question, because this is what happened, you know, to my family member, or, you know, my neighbour couldn't be here, but this is what they wanted me to tell you. I mean, it can take him, you know, another hour to get out of there. So I think he really can connect with people.
I just wanted to ask a couple about the campaign itself.
Sure.
We knew the polls were going to tighten from August, and all sides were saying that beforehand, but is this a lot closer than Labor would have liked and hoped it would be this late on in the campaign?
Look, I'm very confident, but, I mean, it was always going to tighten, and that's what happens in election campaigns. Well, you know, I think not everyone's voted yet. We'll see how, there's a lot of, there's a lot of people who have voted in pre-poll. It might get up to 5 million by the end of today. But I think that, you know, it does tighten. It always does. You know, we'll just have to see, you know, where, how that eventuates. But I think, you know, we're trying as hard. We have left nothing in the locker. I think everything we have put out, you know, our policies have been open and, in fact, have been discussed in some cases for a number of years. We haven't tried to, you know, we've laid out a compelling case for change. And I think that if people, you know, undecided voters wake up on Sunday morning and Scott Morrison is still Prime Minister, they will have 3 more years of the same. Or they could have a very forward-looking Australian government. And, you know, we've been celebrating that with the passing of Bob Hawke. And I would say to undecided voters that really, you know, if you want to have a country you can be proud of, led by someone who has a team around him. You know, I think one of the things we've seen about Scott Morrison is you can have a one-man campaign band, but we all know you can't have a one-man government. And they are, I can tell you...
Okay.
You know, that, well, I just want to make one last point, Tom, that, you know, the Liberals, there's a lot of Liberals who, you know, well, there's some who are campaigning as modern Liberals, some as Liberals. They really need to have a long look at where they are philosophically, I think. I think they've got a lot of division there. They cannot do that in government. They need to actually, you know, a lot of them have sort of laid down weapons and formed a truce for the period of the campaign. And believe me, that a lot of them are looking forward to taking arms up again and resuming hostilities internally in the Liberal Party.
Well, you mentioned the compelling case. We'll know soon enough how compelling it was. Kimberley Kitching, see you on the other side. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks.